The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Thank you, Tally Olson. I am back, comfortably zoned with the Zig Zag Man in Alameda, California, right across the bay from San Francisco, across the moat from Oakland, in the great state of Northern California. And I'm blessed today. I get to talk about my favorite announcer growing up next to Phil Rizzuto. How about Red Barber? Red Barber for you, the old redhead. And I have with me the author of a book about the gentleman. And I'd like to introduce to the network and to the listeners, Ms. Judy Hiltner and Mr. Jim Walker. Start with you, Judy. How are you?
Doing good.
We're doing great.
Oh, good, good. And I assume that the idea of writing the book came from you, Jim, and I don't know why, but that's my assumption. Guys like baseball, and women too. Is that what you're going to do? All right. How did the book come to be? Start with you.
What we would like to say is that it all started at the resale shop across the street from our house. We picked up a book. We had recently retired, and we picked up a book on things to do in retirement, and it had a laundry list of about 500 things that you may not have thought of that you might want to do during your retirement years.
And Jim's an empirical sort of guy, so he said, let's rank them. We'll rank them from 1 to 500, and if we overlap, we'll do the project. And clear, to our surprise, we both put top choice, right biography.
And I had been aware of Red Barber's archive at the University of Florida through an earlier book I'd worked on, and realized no one had really used his archive, and it's very rare for someone like a broadcaster, particularly a baseball broadcaster, to leave his papers. So it just seemed to be a natural project for us to work on and gave us something really interesting to do during some of our retirement years.
Okay.
Well,
now,
why did we do it on Red Barber? And my background is early American literature, and I knew he wasn't going to do a book with me on an early American religious poet. So he said, well, let's think about Red Barber. There are archives, and really these archives, we're talking about 40 boxes and hundreds of photos and other interviews, and they hadn't really been touched. So there was a lot of material to work with. He wrote his own memoirs that were published in '68, so it was just after he left baseball announcing. And his wife actually wrote her own memoir, which kind of gave us, she mentions and talks about things that he doesn't ever bring up. So it gave us two kind of initial stories to start with.
Yeah, we thought that was really amazing. It's just so rare when you're writing a biography of a man that you also get the point of view of his spouse, and so that was something that really struck us as interesting.
Very interesting. I don't know if you remember, we talked a couple of weeks ago, James, when there was a link to the book mentioned on Facebook, and my mother was a secretary in a library in LaGuardia College in New York, and got to meet Red Barber's daughter kind of on an intimate basis. They became very, very close friends, work friends. And she was able to share a lot with me. And I asked you, and you didn't interview her, but you did interview her family. And I'll bring this up real quick, and I'll get it out of the way. His daughter was gay, and not well accepted by Red Barber.
Yeah. I think in what we did had an opportunity to do, and Sarah unfortunately passed away in 2005, long before we really started on the project. But we were able to interview a number of her friends in the gay and lesbian community in Santa Fe, which is where she retired to after she left LaGuardia.
She for about 10 years she was there, and very active. Very
active, and a very, very great contributor to the community at large. And so we did get some perspective on it. I think what we concluded is that initially they were real hesitant about this, and they actually, and this was something that was very traumatic for Sarah, they wanted and paid for her to go through a conversion therapy in the 1950s. This is 1950s, so long before. I think that obviously was a bad idea and was very traumatic.
But let me just say, it was actually electroshock. It was what do you say, anti-seizure?
Electroconvulsive.
Electroconvulsive. And at the time, unfortunately, it was the best practices for people who could afford a psychiatrist and New Yorkers who were read, and his wife had both seen therapists and psychiatrists in their experience. The best practices was to have this. Apparently our research showed that was state of the art at the time, and the doctors who were using it really thought it could help with these conditions, what was then
thought of as a medical condition,
as well as it actually had proved to work, they thought, for some other ailments. And so parents who did not want their children to be, harassed or, in any way sabotaged.
Or suffer the societal abuse that came with being gay.
Would try it. And
so
her friends told us that
they took care of the abuse themselves privately.
Yeah. I think what we concluded, though, is after they got through that phase, and Sarah moved to New York and began working as a teacher first in Harlem in the New York public school system, an elementary school teacher, and then later at LaGuardia. In fact, the attitude to her as a professional and as a person was very positive. They just basically didn't talk about her her lifestyle choice, but or not choice, but her lifestyle.
Well, her father wrote about how proud he was of her. In an interview, he was asked, "Is your daughter married?" And he said, "Well, she's married to her work." And then he went on to say that he thought young people pursuing a career like hers in Harlem to help, under acknowledged and underprivileged children really get a step forward in life was a very noble thing. And she actually had him come when she was teaching and at the college. She arranged something on radio.
Symposium,
radio.
Jim Boughton was also a participant.
Yeah, and to have her father come and talk. And there are letters and there are articles. He wrote a wonderful article when he started to have a newspaper column where he says he doesn't say who he's going to see, but he says he went to have a conversation with a teacher in Harlem. And he says how this is the time when Black Muslims were very active in the community in Harlem, working with young children. And she defended the Black Muslims. She defended they're having as a hero Muhammad Ali, and he came away. He says he came away from that conversation fully informed, and it made him change his way of thinking about some things. And then he tells us in the last sentence that the teacher was his daughter. So he was truly proud of her, as he had to accept, like he had to accept years earlier, the Jackie Robinson in baseball. He had to confront that's what made him kind of interesting. He had to confront some of our nation's biggest challenges before the rest of us did in some ways, and this one in a very personal way. I think we concluded that it was more disappointing, or more of a disappointment in some ways for Lila, because she truly wanted the family to go on. She was a family historian, and she wanted there to be more children and the line of her family name to go on.
Well, that's a very interesting slant at it. My thinking was it really relates directly to Jackie Robinson, because there were two decisions to be made, and he didn't make the conversion to blacks in baseball easier. He took a long time to decide whether or not to accept the position of announcing for a team that was going to accept blacks. It wasn't very popular, not just with Red Barber. The country took to Jackie's coming into baseball very seriously, and he took him a while to decide. Whereas in comparison to someone like Pee Wee Reese, for instance, who was readily accepting of blacks, and he was a Southerner as well. So,
I think the timetable we have doing our research was that Branch Rickey pulled him aside and actually had a private chat with him over lunch.
In 1945.
Just telling him that what his plan was to integrate baseball. And at that point, Jackie Robinson wasn't the person that anyone was looking at, but that this was going to be coming. And Barber's initial reaction was that he wasn't sure he could continue. He went home. He spoke with his wife about it. She said, well, you don't have to make a decision right now about leaving the Dodgers. Why don't we have a couple martinis and think about it? And, by the next morning, he suddenly dawned on him that maybe his prejudice wasn't the best thing in the world. And I think by the time Robinson actually came on the scene in April 1947, he was fully on board with it. And he also kept his distance from all players. He was not someone who socialized at all with players, so that was not a racial issue. And he clearly appreciated Jackie Robinson as a player, and particularly later in his career. In hindsight, what he was thinking in 1947, maybe we don't really know. But later in his career, he complimented Robinson. He became almost a spokesperson for him.
And a personal friend. I mean, let me say this, that when he Branch Rickey said this, he probably, biographers of Branch Rickey think that he brought Red Barber in early because Red Barber was a Southerner, and he knew that it might be a little difficult for Red, and he wanted Red to be prepared, and he maybe wanted to a little bit work on Red to make sure he was ready. And so Red writes in his own memoir, and we cite this in the book, that at the same time that Rickey was telling him he was going to need to accept the integration of baseball, and was going to need to be an announcer of integrated baseball, he was asked by a minister at a nearby church to deliver a talk. And the issue was the church was in Scarsdale, and there was some tensions at the time between Jews and Protestants in Scarsdale. And he wanted Red to give a talk on men and brothers, which comes from St. Paul in the Bible, and the idea was that we don't have a copy of the speech, but we know how St. Paul talked about brotherhood, and for Red, he said it was the notion of agape, that is a Greek word for an openness. It was love, but in a sense of an openness to others, especially the stranger, and the idea that we are all brothers. And he said that he had, as he was writing that speech, the integration of baseball issue was on his mind, and he dug deeper and deeper, and he said that it wasn't that talk wasn't about well-to-do Protestants and Jewish people in Scarsdale. It was about a Southerner having to confront his years and his rearing in a racist culture. And so I think I believe him when he wrote that in his memoirs that he was starting to change. And then I think as time went on, he realized that if he didn't have to take on the whole issue, and this is what maybe you're referring to, he was a little slow to take on the issue directly, but that if he did his job and he treated Jackie Robinson just as any other player, then he'd be doing what his job was called for.
Yeah. That was his way of just sort of not dealing with it, which was pretty common reaction at the time. The debut of Jackie Robinson, if you look at the papers that day in the New York press, many of them don't even mention his race, or in some cases don't mention him at all. And those that do mention him just in passing, because the tendency then was to just simply report the game and not the sort of larger issues that would, of course, be incredibly important today.
Right. Do you think, off the subject a little bit, do you think that Jackie Robinson, the whole Branch Rickey thing and bringing him into baseball, could have happened in any other city but Brooklyn?
Well, that's clearly a what if that you don't know. I think that New York was pretty receptive, probably one of the most receptive. I mean, I could speculate that perhaps in Chicago, but I think Brooklyn being what it was, and the ethnic mix being so strong from so many different lines in the New York area, that created an opportunity that made it more acceptable. But I think, as opposed to the community, I think it's the people that are involved that are important. I think it's the strength of character and the sort of moral mission that Branch Rickey had to do this, and his power and his intelligence and his influence in baseball that could make it possible. So I would look at the individuals, and of course Robinson's contributions, can't be underestimated anyway. So I think it's the people involved that's perhaps more important than the community. But I do think Brooklyn was a much better choice than, say, St. Louis, at that time, or Philadelphia at that time, or Cincinnati.
Even at this time, it doesn't, because they are, those were the two cities that fought integration most in those days. I didn't mean to start it in a way. I should have started by making some reference to just how historic an icon Red Barber was. He was a terrific announcer. And I grew up as a Giant fan, living first in the Bronx with my grandparents, who were avid Giant fans, and we had the choice of listening to Giants announcers or Dodgers announcers in the National League, and whatever game was being played, Red Barber announced it on our radio at that time. He was just absolutely the best. And what I want to give him most credit for, and maybe you guys can tell me how it came about, that that Red picked Vin Scully as his partner and kind of a person for him to learn from. How did that hiring come about?
Well, Red had multiple careers. It's one of the things we found in doing the book, is that he's, of course, best known as the announcer of the Dodgers and then later the Yankees. But in fact, he did many other things. And one of the things, his jobs was as director of CBS Sports in the late 1940s. And during that time, he put together something called College Football Roundup, which would be nothing today, but at the time was pretty marvelous because instead of covering one game, he got CBS to cover multiple college football games and then would cut back and forth between them. And he needed many announcers, and he hired a young man that had come by his office just sort of papering the East Coast with his resume named Vin Scully, who had recently graduated from Fordham. And he sent him up to Fenway Park to cover a college football game. And he was incredibly impressed with his coverage, but he was also impressed because when Scully got there, they didn't have any room for him in the press box, so they stuck him on the roof above the press box in a little area with very little protection from the wind and I think a 60-watt light bulb to keep himself warm. And remember, this was a cold New England late fall day, and Scully just about froze himself to death, but he never said a word about it. And that's word kind of got back to Barber, and he remembered that. And so when Scully came to interview after Ernie Harwell left the Dodger booth and went to the Giants, he remembered him and was incredibly impressed with him. He sent him over to Branch Rickey, who was equally impressed with him, and so the hiring was pretty easy. And Vin Scully was Red Barber, who was always a kind of frustrated teacher and at one point wanted to be a college professor. He was the perfect pupil, and Red was a very difficult teacher. He was not one that graded easy on the curve. He could be persnickety and he could be a little bit tyrannical, yes. But Scully was willing to listen and did listen and adopted many of his characteristics. And of course, the man was incredibly talented in his own way. But Barber certainly took him on as a willing pupil. And
he hadn't actually done baseball before, I don't believe. And so he was starting with somebody who had no experience, and he could shape and mold. And
he did. And what's interesting to us when we did the book is he tried to do the same thing with Phil Rizzuto in the mid-1950s over at the Yankees. And at that point, he wasn't really given the authority, and Rizzuto was much more his own man and had been a player, and saw this as a secondary career. Whereas, of course, for Scully, this being a broadcaster was his profession, and so Barber was frustrated with Rizzuto, although clearly he contributed to Phil's development as well.
Well. Tell me a little bit about what made Red Barber laugh, because I haven't ever heard of him experiencing much humor in his life. He was a very tight, serious person. Did he ever get a chance to laugh, and at who? What humor?
Well, I guess I could reinforce what you just said. When we listened to we were able to listen to the original tapes that were used to construct his memoir, written, published in 1968, and we were able to listen to the original reel-to-reel tapes and get all the stuff that wasn't included. And listening to hours and hours of tape, and the entire time, Red Barber tells one joke. And this is with the guy he's working with. But I think he did have a sense of humor, but he really saw his job as a professional reporter. He really kind of came out of a period of time when professionalism in broadcast journalism was taken in sport as well. And he didn't see sports as just entertainment. He didn't see his job as servicing the management of the club. He certainly understood who he worked for and who paid his checks, and he knew that sponsors were important and so forth. But he saw when he was in front of the microphone, his job was to report what was going on the field. And that doesn't mean there isn't some humor there as well, an analysis, but he was really doggedly about his preparation and knowing the material. And this was at a time when the information wasn't readily available to you the way it is now. Well, you really had to go out and find it.
Well, in fact, Red wasn't a terrifically social person. He really respected his privacy. He wanted to come home from work and just be with his wife and daughter, which Sarah herself, she wrote a little bit about her parents too, and she said we were a very close family. But he saw home as he didn't like being on the road that much. He thought home was a place you go and recuperate and you sort of regroup and you gain, a rich sense of energy for the next day.
And you read. He loved to read.
He loved to read and listen to opera and symphony. But also this might sound unconnected, but he did have trouble with his voice. He actually thought he really lost his voice early in his career, and he had just been talking a whole lot. It was when he was doing a lot of work raising money for the Red Cross during the war, and he would go to great big rallies and have to talk all the time, and he was doing his broadcast work anyway. He lost his voice, and the doctor told him, "You're not going to be able to unless you talk less and you talk slower and you talk and you don't talk and lower. You're going to be at peril." So he really trained himself. The job meant so much to him that he actually didn't. The doctor said he had to not talk at all for a week, which was very tough. But he actually was always kind of nurturing his voice, and he didn't want to waste time talking. He liked conversations, and he had very good conversations, especially interviews with people. But he didn't want to waste his voice for nothing. He wasn't a small talker, right. And he was. There was a number of people who worked with him described him as a little standoffish. Who was the man? Tom
Valenti.
Valenti, who produced some of his
Dr. Television cast.
He said that when Red Barber went on the air, this folksy kind of entertaining voice came on, and then as soon as the game was over, he was a different. He said Scully was always Scully, and Mel Allen was always Mel Allen, but Red Barber, when he got off the microphone, he was somewhat shy, reserved, and always kind of introspective. And he does, you can see in his writing, he is a very introspective person who questions himself quite a lot and realizes that he has to keep being a better man.
And he really started as...
What would have Red done if he weren't a broadcaster? If he didn't get into...
he would have been a college professor. He would have been a college professor at probably the University of Florida. That's what he was tracking, and then radio just kind of almost accidentally fell into it, and he was really, really good at it. And then he eventually realized it would be his career, but he definitely wanted to be a teacher. His mother was an educator, and she had had a very successful career as that. And I think he really loved reading. He loved learning.
He loved entertaining and performing. He might have become a university professor. He didn't really he was a rambling reader. Yeah. And he talked about one time the library, the old musty books in the library, and he wanted to go out and do, a performance. Right. I don't know if he would have. I think he would have become a public figure in some way. He may have gone into ministry. He
may have gone into ministry. That's possible. But in his own words, he became good friends with a number of university faculty by working in a university club, which is where single male professors would live at universities, and he was kind of the janitor, custodian, but he became good friends with them. And I think at that point anyway, he was moving in that direction. And he certainly loved being a teacher, and he loved educating. And so I think that's what he would have done.
Okay, there was kind of a crisis in his broadcasting career. There was a time when the announcers for the World Series were picked by the teams who won the World Series, and he and Mel Allen basically did all those great 52, 53, great World Series. That came to an end. Can you tell me what was the reason for it? Was it sponsorship? But there was a time when both he and Mel Allen stopped doing the World Series, and I don't think it was their choice. Can you tell me what that was about?
Yeah, in the case, I'll give you Red's case first. at the time that Red stopped doing the World Series, his last World Series was 1952. He didn't do the 53, and by 54 he was with the Yankees. What happened in 53 is the decision on the announcers actually was controlled by the sponsor, and in this case it was Gillette and their advertising agency. And their policy was to pay a flat rate to announcers for doing the World Series, and that rate was $200 per game, which, obviously that was a little more money in 1952, but it was still a relatively trivial sum, given that this was the premier sporting event in America at the time. And Red just sort of drew the line in the sand, and he'd gotten his check from 52, and he just said, well, I'm just not doing this again unless I can negotiate my contract. I'm not going to take it or leave it kind of deal. And that was really the concern. And when the advertising agency said, no, this is it, this is what you're going to get, he said, well, I'm leaving it. That's it. And he just felt that it was just a disrespectful amount of money. It wasn't that he needed the money that much.
He just wanted to be consulted.
He wanted to be consulted.
They named him that without even asking.
They actually announced that he would be doing it without getting his agreement.
So a lot of the newspaper reporters thought, it was kind of heroic and kind of noble that he said, you can't assume, and I should be paid what I'm worth.
He was very happy when Vin Scully was selected to replace him on the World Series for 1953, which at the time Vin was a very young announcer and just kind of starting to develop his own voice, and so this was a huge boost in his career. So it was really great. And Vin actually went to Red and said, "They've asked me to do this. Is that okay?" And he